We often assume modern courts are neutral arbiters of justice, but when an independent nation uses an imported legal framework to judge its own indigenous practices, that neutrality collapses. In 2018, the Supreme Court of India heard the Sabarmala Temple case, a dispute over specific religious practices that exposed a deep conflict in the law. At the center of the debate was a uniquely indigenous juristic concept, the recognition of the temple's deity not as an inanimate idol, but as a living person with distinct constitutional rights. Opponents attacked these beliefs using specific pejoratives, labeling the traditions anti-rational, orthodox, and anti-modern. Native, post-colonial lawyers, trained in the colonizer's lexicon, led these attacks against their own civilizational heritage. This raises a question about where this specific legal vocabulary came from and why its default posture remains hostile toward Native traditions. Terms like rational and modern in this context are artifacts of an imported, Eurocentric worldview designed to evaluate and categorize indigenous cultures. What we are witnessing in courts worldwide is the execution of an invisible algorithm. It is a system of control known as coloniality, and it continues to govern modern institutions long after physical empires have fallen. To understand how this algorithm operates, we must distinguish the physical act of colonialism from the psychological framework of coloniality. Colonialism refers to the historical period of political subjugation and the physical extraction of resources by a foreign power. Coloniality is the underlying epistemological matrix of power. It colonizes the imagination, dictating what a society considers valid knowledge and governance. Because this matrix reshapes the native mind, coloniality functions seamlessly after the colonizer leaves. The dominant native elite simply step into their shoes. Political independence is an illusion if legal, cultural, and educational operating systems remain entirely Eurocentric. We are taught that Western legal frameworks are rooted purely in secular rationalism. The historical record shows otherwise. The universalist worldview that dominates today traces its origins to the 15th century, during the Age of Discovery. This document is the foundational source code of the colonial matrix, the 1493 papal bull Inter Caetera. The text contains an explicit directive commanding that barbarous nations be overthrown, and establishes a mandate demanding newly subjugated nations be brought to the Catholic faith. This decree manufactured a right for European powers to rank, classify, and systematically erase non-Christian civilizations globally. This explicitly theological supremacy did not vanish. Over centuries, it secularized into the supposedly neutral concepts we now export as universal human rights and global progress. European history romanticizes the 1492 voyage as a heroic achievement, a necessary expansion into what they termed the New World. For the indigenous populations on the receiving end of this expansion, the reality was one of immediate repression. The implementation of the papal mandate led to extreme racial classification systems designed to facilitate ruthless economic extraction. Engravings from the era document atrocities committed by Spanish soldiers, legally justified by a newly invented Eurocentric hierarchy, redefining indigenous humans as raw materials. The Age of Discovery was the rollout of a global racial hierarchy, one that stripped indigenous societies of their sovereignty and their humanity. Physical subjugation was only the first step. European coloniality achieved its ultimate victory by hijacking the concept of time itself. Tracing the word modern reveals origins in 6th century Italy, meaning simply different. By the 14th century, it shifted to contemporary, comparing present with past. But in the 16th century, coinciding with global colonization, the definition deliberately shifted toward hierarchy. Modern was weaponized. It became an exclusive descriptor for European, scientific, and rational thought. The dark inverse of this shift was the redefinition of the word traditional. It was actively coded to mean inferior, parochial, and primitive. This semantic trick automatically invalidated any surviving indigenous knowledge system. By defining native epistemology as traditional, it permanently framed it as stuck in the past. Modernity is not an objective measure of technological progress. It is a cultural weapon designed to delete non-European worldviews without firing a single shot. Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano systematized this phenomenon in his theory of the coloniality of power, identifying that the colonizers successfully monopolized time, space, and subjectivity, making them the exclusive preserve of Europe. This power matrix forces all colonized cultures to judge their own self-worth, their laws, and their religions against a single imported benchmark. Fast forward to the 20th century, an era marked by widespread political decolonization and the rise of native elites taking power across the globe. These newly independent nations fell into the ideological trap of post-colonialism. Native elites sought to run their own nations, but they voluntarily retained the colonizers' institutional operating system. They used European political, legal, and educational frameworks to build their new states, ignoring their own pre-colonial systems. Post-colonialism fails because seeking political sovereignty while completely surrendering epistemic sovereignty leaves the colonial matrix intact. The radical solution to this systemic trap is decoloniality. The core action of decoloniality is epistemic disobedience. This means actively refusing to accept the Western normative framework as the default universal standard for reality and governance. Most current decolonial scholarship originates in Latin America and focuses almost entirely on racial hierarchies. This comparison shows why a strictly race-based focus is insufficient for Asia. The Americas experienced near-total theological conversion to the colonizers' faith, largely erasing indigenous religious identity. In contrast, vast swaths of Asia retained their living, pre-colonial indigenous faiths, despite centuries of foreign rule. Because Indic civilization survived, its decolonial fight must uniquely address theological coloniality, resisting the evangelical motivations embedded in Western secular laws. This exact conflict plays out today when lawyers and religious figures clash over whether an ancient deity has constitutional rights in a modern Indian court. The ultimate systemic goal of decoloniality is what scholar Walter Mignolo calls a pluriverse. It's a world where multiple, distinct epistemologies interact as equals. This means no longer forcing all cultures to conform to a single European center. Civilisational sovereignty demands the arduous task of reinscribing indigenous consciousness into the very institutions that will write the future.